Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Dan here, and we are going to, this is a series on core ideas of Nietzsche. We're going to cover at least 5 ideas, perhaps more. Today we are supposed to cover death of God and will to power, but it looks like death of God is big enough topic for one meetup. What are we trying to do is this is actually a very interesting format. This is going to be very interactive. This is going to be very dramatic. And I am just delighted to have Dan here, who has been studying Nietzsche for the past 2 decades. So Dan, who is Nietzsche?
Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche is a Prussian German philosopher, born in 1840, died in 1900. His last formal publication was 1889. He is a German philosopher that stands out of a context between Kant and Hegel, and an alternative to Kierkegaard in the compendium of what philosophy is. Nietzsche not only represents the future post-structuralism, existentialism, and quintessentially thought as the forefather of postmodernism strictly. Today, we will try to talk about Nietzsche from the perspective of aesthetics. So the crucial issue today is the issue of God. And to start with Nietzsche, almost everything Nietzsche, we would really require a kind of diagnosis so that we know, hopefully this works. Yes, so we can know precisely what Nietzsche represents as a theory. So this should explicate what Nietzsche is doing. So what is the meaning of life? We are led
Dan,
to ask,
could you start
yes,
your video?
Oh, it's not a video, it's just...
No. I mean, your video has been turned off. Yeah, there. Perfect.
I see. Okay. So with everything concerning Nietzsche, his question is, what is the meaning of life? Which we are led to ask, how are we to endure life? And what is the value of life? And of course, what is the value of value? Nietzsche answers these questions with the following observational critiques. The first one is called the reason critique. We are rational beings inside an irrational universe. Modern life is a chaotic, dynamic process. It doesn't need to adhere to our reason. Rather, we are rational beings in an irrational world looking to make it sensible to our understanding. His second critique is called the value critique, that the value of life must be confined to the limits of life or the limits of our existence. We have no reason whatsoever to believe in any such thing as a sense or value of life insofar as these terms imply the idea of an objective, natural purpose of life. The third one is called the subject orientation critique. Our lives are value orientated. We couldn't live without this orientation. So without some adherence to some sets of values or other, human life would be virtually impossible. Now, the truth is, this last critique usually stands at odds to the first 2 critiques. That is, sometimes Nietzsche employs the first critique and then asks the reader, now how do you orientate yourself now that I've taken this standard from you to orientate to? And that's what we're going to do today when we analyze the death of God. So let's move to my iCloud drive. Now, let us start. First, I want to present what Nietzsche is trying to do. His view is that we create order and we create chaos. That is, we are destroyers and we are creators. And this is the central idea about God. Nietzsche believes that mankind created God for a reason. And this reason, of course, we'll get into here in passage 125. So let's begin with the first passage on the death of God. Now, I'm going to first say that this is what Nietzsche employs as a prologued story. That is, the story itself is an alternative account to a standard story. Oh, my, it's gone away. We'll try again. Just give me a moment.
Sure.
We'll get right there. All right. There we are. So this is a prologued account of something. And the something is the standard story of Buddha. Siddhartha, as we know, grew old, grew sickly. He didn't want to live anymore, and he begged to die and allowed himself to be poisoned. Now, with that part of the story in mind, we can go and read this passage to see why he chooses an alternative account to what the standard account we have. So, after Buddha had died, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still need to overcome his shadow. So what this tells us is that Nietzsche approaches this idea of religion with cynicism. His view is that these people's loss of Siddhartha or Buddha caused such great grief that they grabbed on to anything that would allow them to create meaning for themselves. And by doing that, they have created a shadow of something that they had been previously given. They've taken the shadow of let's say, the lighting of illumination of understanding. They're now worshiping the shadow in this process. Now, Nietzsche's presentation of this is cynical for a reason, so that when we get into subselection 125, we'll see why Nietzsche is cynical in this passage. So let's have a little bit of back and forth to try to talk this out.
Sure. So let's start with this. Let me ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up. Folks, this is going to be quite interactive. So go ahead and type ! if you'd like to ask questions. So go ahead and ask questions. Dan is going to answer as Nietzsche would answer, as best as he understands Nietzsche would answer, okay? So firstly, what is the Christian God?
I like that question, David. Yes, if we accept Nietzsche's method, if Nietzsche's method is a prologued account, so a log account would be a standard, like an analog or analogical or logarithm. The term log means account. So a prologue would be an alternative account. So yes, in some ways, Nietzsche is presenting it as his own shadow. And he is the shadow in this way of what the idea is.
Okay, so the question, so let me go ahead and ask questions. So what we'll do is that you can pretty much ignore the chat. Dan, I'm going to go ahead and get questions either through the people asking questions, and I will talk out the questions. I'll call upon people who have put things in chat to answer that, because otherwise there is not a good flow of dialogue that most people can get. So let's start with Phil, followed by Dave. Phil, what's your question?
So you are kind of saying that people are so desperate for meaning in life that if they lose that meaning, they would rather worship a shadow than to actually have nothing. Or because they're incapable of creating a new meaning on their own, they need at least shadows to, in a sense, give meaning to their existence. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's partially because the subject in that state is a conventionalist. In that state, if we say diagnostically, Nietzsche would say that this is somebody between the state of the metamorphosis of spirit to camel. That's where they are in their life. If they're conventionalists, that is, they haven't mastered conventions correctly. So They're just adopting to whatever would function and help and act as a psychological ointment for their troubles and suffering.
Wonderful. Dave.
Yes, Mr. Nietzsche, did God create man or did man create God?
Well, I have to say that I wrote that very differently. I wrote, is God man's mistake or man God's mistake? Because from this perspective, we have two perspectives, the religious and the secular. From the secular, it's that human beings, being such crooked timber called humanity, as Kant says, have tried to fashion something straight, but which is still bent.
Wonderful. Fantastic question, fantastic answer. We are off to a great start. Next up is Madeline, followed by Mike. Madeline, what's your question?
Yes, Mr. Nietzsche. My question is, in writing about the camel, were you using that as a symbol for the Abrahamic religions, all three of them?
Actually, I was using it in reference to Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster is a word for golden camel herder in Persian, as I recall from my original studies in, I believe, 1863, when I was beginning to invest in Zoroastrianism and Greek, what you might think is Greek theology.
Wonderful. Next question is from Mike. Mike, what's your question?
Herr Professor, my understanding about God is dead, there's a couple more paragraphs following that. God is dead and we killed him and we can't stand it anymore. And the blood is all over and we don't know what to do with the knives and Eternal Recurrence said he's going to come back and we'll be sorry. What were you thinking, Herr Nietzsche, Herr Professor?
Well, first I have to say that I had this strange dream about the cynic Diogenes. And it was weird because I thought in some ways Diogenes didn't live in a land full of cynics. He lived in a land full of idealists. And so I wrote the beginning of that passage of thinking about how I, as another kind of cynic, would have responded to Diogenes running into the marketplace with a lantern. But that struck me very odd because I had an idea that was very similar, that Martin Luther himself, I mean, I've lived with Martin Luther's autobiography next to my bed my entire life. And there's just one passage that I've underlined hundreds of thousands of times in this book. And that is that Martin Luther, when asked when he was thought about Rome, when he returned, he said that in Rome, God is dead. No one believes it. It's merely a tool to control the populace. I didn't say God was dead. Martin Luther said it. Then it was written, put into his biography, and I obsessed about it for the rest of my life.
Wonderful. Next question is from Phil.
Yeah, Professor, I'm sure you must have heard of Plato and Plato's cave. Quite often, we just talk about Plato's cave as just a shadows in the wall. But in fact, in that cave, there were men in the back. I presume they were creative men who were casting a shadow play. So was Plato being a cynic in terms of having these artists who are supposed to be creative, manipulating the people so they would fall in love with the shadow rather than going out there and creating, at the very minimum, shadows themselves, or perhaps even crawl out of the cave? Could you say something about that?
Wonderful. Well, when I first began writing the book, Human All Too Human, and unfortunately it was 2 volumes, one of the parts of the volumes I became obsessed with was this idea of a wanderer and a shadow. And I began playing with it, but then unconsciously I realized that there was Plato, and then I realized there was Moses, and then I realized that there was Muhammad, And then there was Zoroaster. And I realized that a lot of the founders of thought all used the symbol of shadow and cave. And so when I wrote the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home, the lake of his home. And there he enjoyed his solitude for 10 years. One day he woke up and he looked at the bright morning sun and he said, "Oh, you great star, what would your happiness be had you not those for whom you shined?" I wrote that with that in mind, with this idea that, yes, we can find this inner depth to bring ourselves illuminated. And the idea struck me that I would become an arsonist if I was that way. If I had gone into the deep part of the cave and brought out fire, nobody would ever see me as anything but an arsonist. They see me even now as a destroyer of all values.
Wonderful. Next up is Brian, followed by Kevin. Brian.
So I'm interested in this, the idea of the light and the shadow that came out in the prologue, Buddha being the light and the shadow being the memory that his followers cling to. It seems to me possible that that's always the case if we have someone who's speaking and someone who's listening. The person who is speaking or creating the story, creating the narrative, creating the idea is creating the light, and those who hear it are just living in a shadow. It might be the same story and they both embrace it, but because one said it and one heard it, it's perceived and understood differently. Could you comment, please?
When I first started thinking about monotheism, I started thinking about the first form of dualism that was created for people. This idea of good and evil, light and dark. And when I studied Zoroastrianism, one of the things that I found was so beautiful was that the Farhavar represented it completely. Here was man put up high, and at his waist was the sun. Now before him, he held a ball of light, and his hand is in front of him so that it doesn't blind him. Most importantly, he looks down. He doesn't look into the light, but he looks down, and beneath him, at the lining of the sun that's around his waist, is a serpent. And he's riding an eagle. And on the eagle is the ethics, the bare metaphysical ethics. That is good mind, good speech, and good action. That those were the quintessential things that could dominate this dualism of good and evil. This was his diagnosis and his way of treating an unfair world. And I thought that this was carried forth in Judaism, in Judeo-Christianity, and even in the Greek pantheon of all the gods. This is what interested me about this representation of light and shadow.
Wonderful. Kevin.
Thank you, Sangha. Thank you, Dan. My question is, God, by that definition, is eternal and all-powerful. So what did it cause the death of God? Like, when
yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, as I was talking, in Zoroastrianism, God and the devil, as you might think of them, they're not omnipotent. They're limited by one another. So they're astronomically powerful, right? But they're not omnipotent. What I found was that my own theories of metaphysics found that a lot of metaphysical claims about eternity and wholes, these were superficial and shallow. They don't really represent anything that the human could ingest to find a good compass to figure things out. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't think Plato did a great job, but this is a problematic. Now, the reason why I think that death of God is something serious is that I think God as an idea represented a people, a time. We don't live in a modern world, and this system of thought is anachronistic to the demands of our time. And we haven't outgrown this. But the problem is that God does represent something meaningful to people. It's just unfortunate most people don't believe that. We've become too cynical to be changed and transformed by that idea. And this is why the death of God is something that's happened.
Phil, what's your question?
Professor, I couldn't help what you said that, you know, the opposition of creation, the destruction and creation, on the one hand does represent a degree of a creative process. But you said man created God, and this was a reflection of man understanding that creative process. There must have been some influence from the Hindu tradition, but you have left out Vishnu, who's the sustainer God. Why did you leave out Vishnu, the sustainer God, without seeing its important in relationship to the creator, Brahman, and the destroyer, Shiva? Could you say something about, does the sustainer God not exist in your understanding?
What I've always taken from Hinduism, as well from Stoicism and Epicureanism, is the idea that our existence is a drama found in a cycle, and that we're all part of some weird cycle that repeats itself over again and again and again. And the trouble I had with that is, yes, you're right, Vishnu is a sustainer, but it doesn't make me feel gay and happy to think about things like this. I wanted to transform myself from this idea. I wanted this idea to be transformative. And in order for it to be transformative, I needed to have weight. You know, the truth is that the death of God frees us up. It makes us more irresponsible. We need something that grounds us. So I created the Eternal Recurrence. It's an idea that tells you as an existential test that says, everything you have done, do you want to keep repeating all your mistakes, all your failures, or do you want to overcome them and create something else, something new away from that? And in order to do that, you have to be honest to look at your own regret. And this is a hard thing. And that the point of the Eternal Recurrence was to lead the subject into realizing that they have power over their cycle. And I think Hinduism, even Buddhism, attempts to say that, but fails.
One last question, and then we can go to the next paragraph. Why did man create God?
I thought about this a lot. And when I began my professional career, I thought that I would just think about two different types of gods to try to represent an answer. Because I think the reason why human beings have created God is that it treats their problem of suffering. And so Dionysus and Apollo appealed to me because both of them gave an answer. Apollo said that you can dream and rationalize yourself out of your problems. You can use your reason to make sense of an irrational world for yourself. But I found that that was too idealistic. That was so attractive to Socrates, so attractive to idealists and Platonists and Neoplatonists all, that it just wasn't sufficient. But then I realized that tragedy was created as a system to give real catharsis to the subject, but it had to marry something that was rational with something irrational. And I realized that this part, that intoxication gave us real truth. It was visceral. It was in your gut. It told you what the real meaning of life was, that you're going to be blown to pieces, that you're falling apart and you're being put together all at the same time. And that to me was beautiful. So when I thought about why people created God because there was a suffering in their own life that they wanted these inequities to be solved. And they always cast their hopes in afterworldly hopes. And this doesn't feed you. It makes you stir crazy because it doesn't give you anything in return but more sorrow. And I wanted to tell you that no, there's an alternative. Turn your life into a work of art. Stop looking for meaning outside of yourself. Turn yourself into a meaning generator. That was the purpose of my work.
Wow. All right, we'll take one last question and then we will go to the next paragraph. Brian, what's your question?
You have said, Herr Professor, you have said that the people created religion, and the people did this, and the people did that. Isn't it true that it's Übermenschen that created religions? And they are the ones who are the light, and everyone else is looking at the shadow created by religion.
I initially thought about leaders being these idolized Übermensches, these overmen, these people who can overcome themselves, and that they can see beyond the conventions of their time. But the problem is that every time that has ever happened, it's always fallen on deaf ears, and we've taken steps backward, not forward. And I've realized that maybe the problem is to stop giving the message to the masses because they can't digest it, and they turn it into nothing but soil and shit. My idea, however, is to say that only the excellent person, only the person who's pushed himself beyond all boundaries, who's overcome as much adversity as humanly possible, only that person deserves to create values. Because it is adversity that taught them that values have to come from experience, not just from learned reading.
Wow. All right, Professor Nietzsche, can we go to your next paragraph?
Yes, sir. All right, let us dive into the death of God. Or actually, let's read what God is. To me, I want to say that God is any rationalizing principle that sufficiently provides meaning to a subject. That the Judeo-Christian God is not the only God on the books that we worship, and that there are many types of God. There's a God of a mechanistic God, a God of physics. There is a God of Gaia, for which we believe that organic systems is the prime mover of our existence. I want to present to you how this is not the case. Let's try to share it one more time and get right to it. There we go. So let me read to you. Let us beware of thinking the world is a living being. Where should it expand? And what should it feed? How could it grow and multiply? We have some notion of the nature of the organic, and we should not reinterpret what we perceive only on the crust of the earth as and make of it something that is essential, universal. And let me try to correct that by going, that was not good. Let's hit this, copy. Let's try it here. See if I can keep it stable. There we go. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Darn it. Maybe it's this one.
Dan, you can go ahead and just read it out. It's not necessary to put it up on the screen.
Okay, I'll just stop my video and read it from my, here we go. And we should not reinterpret what we perceive only on the crust of the earth as and make it something essential, universal, eternal, which is what those people do who call the universe an organism. This nauseates me. Let us beware of believing that the world is a machine. It's certainly constructed, it's not constructed for one purpose, and calling it a machine does it far too much honor. The astral order in which we live is just an exception. This order and relative duration that depends on it have again been made possible, the exception of exceptions, the formation of the organic. Yet the total character of the world, however, in all eternity is chaos. Not in the sense that it lacks and in the sense not of a lack of necessity, but a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom, and what other names there are for our aesthetic anthropomorphisms. But how could we reproach and praise the universe? None of our aesthetic and moral judgments apply to it, nor does it have any instinct for self-preservation or any other instinct. And it does not even observe any laws either. Let us beware of saying that there are laws of nature. There are only necessities. There's no one who commands, nobody who obeys, and therefore nobody who trespasses. Now, once you know that there are no purposes, you also know that there is no accident, for it is only beside a world of purposes that the word accident has any meaning. Let us beware of saying that death is opposed to life. The living is merely a type of dead, and a very rare type. When shall we be done with our caution and care for these things? When will these shadows of God cease to darken our minds? When will we complete our de-deification of nature? When may we begin to naturalize humanity in terms of a pure, newly discovered, newly redeemed nature?
Wonderful. Folks, time for questions. Go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Let me start out. Professor, the thing that blew me away is your start of this paragraph, where you say that God is that which provides meaning. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
When the sun rises and you're in the dark, you don't know your left from your right. You don't know you're up from your down. You don't know you're forward from your backward. When the sun rises, it gives you a context. Because it lights things up, the world becomes in full view. You would see what is left from what is right, what is up from down, what is forward from back. The sun and its orientation is a metaphorical symbol of God. Most worship the sun for years because of this orientation. I read the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra with this in mind. Zarathustra goes into a cave and watches the sun come up and go down, sun come up, go down as a cycle for 10 years. He didn't tire of this. I think of that as 10,000 years. That is what is the history of mankind. 10,000 years that this has gone on and nothing has changed. We are star children and we have not yet been able to pull ourselves off of this star and go beyond the horizon of our own solar system. And it's because we've chiefly been up to these squabbles about God. Perhaps if I killed God, we can get up there. Maybe we'll let it go and start growing up.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, David, Kevin, and Allison. Joe.
Thank you, Professor, for your answers this evening. The one criticism that you had is that don't think of the world or the universe as a living organism. And is this your major criticism of ancient Stoicism and reason why you didn't necessarily believe in Stoicism or had problems with them philosophically?
Yes, because they had an organic perspective and they thought that the organic was God. And this is a problem because to me, this is shallow. We live on barely a piece of paper called the earth. That might be 10,000 miles underneath us. We still aren't even close to the center of the earth. So we live on only the crust, only the surface of things. And we are talking about things that are well beyond that. And we believe things that are well beyond that.
And can I
Yes,
really
please.
quick follow up? So would you consider yourself a modern Stoic if the Stoicism was willing to abandon that principle?
Yes, I would. Well, I would consider myself a postmodern Stoic because the central ethics that I want is responsibility.
Right.
I want the human subject to be responsible for themselves.
Thank you. Next up is David, Kevin, and Allison. David.
You're extremely skeptical of values and gods and projecting the Earth's characteristics onto the rest of the universe. So what do you think is what is the bottom line as far as your philosophy is concerned? What should humans be doing? I know you sort of hinted at it, but I'd like to a concise and clear. What would you suggest the way we should live, or what? I don't know. I mean, Superman. What should they be doing?
I am so amazed, as Nietzsche, that we put a man on the moon. We need to put somebody on Alpha Centauri. We need to break this relationship between us and the sun. Very fascinating. Somebody had told me that they have now created a thing called a Kardov scale. And we're not even on the Kardov scale. We haven't even learned how to yield the sun's actual power. And the main reason is because we're held back.
By what? We're held back by vast distances and incredible. It's a huge universe. So I mean, what's your point?
We're held back by equality. Equality, unfortunately, has become something that caters to the lowest common denominator. It doesn't allow excellence. In some ways, I'm advocating for people to break this, to challenge these things, to go beyond it, to turn your life into a work of art, to experiment, to see what those limits are.
Thank you.
Go ahead, David.
We'll have plenty of, okay, David, go ahead. You can do a follow-up.
Well, I'm just going to say,
very quick.
It's all very nice and abstract, but it doesn't really tell me anything specific. What should I, little humble me, be doing, Nietzsche?
You should be becoming intoxicated with your reality. There you go.
Next up,
the raising of the wrist, as Monty Python put it.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed Kevin, Allison, and Phil. Kevin.
Hi, Professor. My question: do you agree God is the best art created by a human being?
Best
art.
Can you repeat, please?
We see it as either God or art. We create things. So I consider, let's see, God is a human being created, right? I would say it's best of art.
I would agree. What I saw between the Greeks was that they created gods to solve problems that they psychologically couldn't. When they experienced catharsis, they set the gods to the ground, to the side, and went on with their life. This is how the Greeks used art. They used their suffering to transform it into art so that they would find a way to treat that problem inside of themselves. Once that divine problem found a solution, they let it go. There was no more need for it. When you talk about Judeo-Christianity, you talk about somebody who grasps something and won't let it go. They try to turn it and make it stable and static. They try to eternalize it. And it's too hyperbolic for that reason. It's not believable.
Thank you. Next up is Allison, Phil, and Alvaro. Allison, what's your question?
Hi, Mr. Nietzsche. If all religion disappeared from the earth and nobody believed in any religion at all, do you think that people would make more ethical choices? And do you think that there would be less war?
I advocate for the position of adversity. More wars, less peace. Adversity makes us who we are. I'm Nietzsche. This is my job to represent him correctly. I think that there was much more to your question. I wanted to answer that part. What was the beginning of your question?
Would people make more ethical choices?
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. And here's why I believe that. It is from our own material concerns that we understand the wrongness of murder, of exploitation. I try to advise my readers to distrust all of whom the impulse to punish is great. I'm trying to counsel you about their ethics, about the Judeo-Christian ethics of revenge, of pity, of resentment. These are values of very small people who want to turn everybody smaller. I think if we did get rid of religion, people would fall in line naturally into the moral psychology that we all possess already. But I don't think that we can reset history. This is unrealistic. And this is why we'll always live in some degree of conflict.
Thank you. Next up is Phil, followed by Alvaro. Phil.
Yeah, I do want to return to the God of sustainability. It seems to me, with only the God of creation and destruction, it really is a universe of transcendence, because you're caught in an endless cycle. However, if you let in this sort of like sustainability, what you have is a punctuated cycle in which you, in a sense, is allowing temporality to exist in a human form that reaches for the cyclical cycle. And I think that you have left out this human dimension in temporality that is actually reaching beyond. And I think that to me, Professor, is a shortcoming of the eternal man always churning over and over again.
Thank you. You know, I think that the death of God in some ways usurps our understanding of value and reason. But I think in some ways, the failure of my idea is that I know that all of us require an orientation in order to operate. And if I took away the most important orientation that we all have, how are we to operate without it? I think historically, God got usurped from the throne. And what happened were there were many pretenders. Science is but one of them that tried to step onto the throne. Now, I wrote the gay science with this in mind because I thought that this was a serious threat. Science is good at description. It's not very good at prescription. It can't tell you what to do, but it can tell you what there is. My solution was to look at art as an attempt to try to build a gayer science out of all of this. Hopefully I have answered this, but I don't think I have done it very well.
Thank you. Next up is Alvaro, followed by Mike. Alvaro, what's your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Dr. Nietzsche, I am a practicing Stoic, or at least I try to be. And because of that, I seek to live according to nature. My goal is to be a virtuous person, to be a sage or a wise man. That is my work of art, living a virtuous life. By living according to nature, I seek to control my passions. How does your philosophy address taking control of your passions in order to live a work of art?
Thank you, Alvaro. I thought about this at a great deal. The beginning of my work, I wrote a short piece called Untimely Meditations on the use and abuse of history of life. And what I said was that there are essentially two types of human. One type of human who is pricked in the finger and spends the rest of their life complaining, bleeding to death. The other type of character, an ordinary person who has his arm twisted off his body. And after that becomes a happy, full, complete man. I think that in some ways, all of us have this kind of deterministic characteristic in ourselves. Now, this might not be a very good thing because it leads us to a lot of destruction, but it also leads us to experimentation and recreation and or exploration. I don't remember the rest of your question.
I mean,
Yeah.
what he was asking is that what is the role of control of passion in order to
Yes.
live with, as per the dictates of the nature?
Well, let me give you a better answer. All of our life requires us to filter out things that are unimportant and focus on the things that are important. Passion is the same thing. Anger is the same thing. Sorrow is the same thing. They're products of our own filtration of existence. In some ways, you have to be passionate, but it's only appropriate in the way that, let's say, if I'm passionate about something and I know it's inappropriate, I should learn how to redirect that passion to something constructive. Just in the same way that it's okay to be angry at somebody, but it's not okay to act it out. And to me, learning how to overcome my passions, my angers, my emotional state and awareness, to overcome these things teaches me self-mastery. But if you're Stoic, it means that you don't tempt that fate. You don't go near it. You live by the same kind of Jewish wisdom that says that the wise avoid the very things that the clever have to figure their way out of. That Stoicism practices this avoidance of these kinds of problems so that it can maintain a peace of mind. And this virtue is wonderful, but it doesn't build character. Adversity builds character.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by David. Mike.
Yeah, Professor. Once again, in the principle of the eternal recurrence, in your new reincarnation, what do you think of what the universe has done with your philosophies, in particular, Herr Hitler and Fox News?
My poor sister. I told her that I gave her a letter years ago. I want to read the end of that letter because it's important. Faith does not offer the least support for any proof of an objective truth. Here the way of men part. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. I think that my people bastardized and made my ideas ugly. They made my view ugly. I never talked about a people becoming superior. I talked about a person overcoming the herd, not to become a shepherd, and not to become a wolf, but become something beyond all of those things. I am sickened by it, but I want to tell you some things that you left out. In America, the invention of jazz. This, I would love to take credit for. Improvisation and improvement of the musical instruments in the way of self-mastery. Have you not cried listening to Miles Davis and John Coltrane? I have. Better than Wagner, better than Wagner. There are all kinds of beautiful experiments that have justified our existence and made the world more beautiful than those small, tiny, misguided humans who turned the world wretched and ugly.
Thank you. Next up is David, followed by Madeline. David.
You talk of necessity as governing the world, so to speak, or governing the way things work. And yet you also talk about art and suggesting it's some sort of creative endeavor. To me, there's an inherent contradiction between necessity governing and creativity, which presumably means some sort of autonomy. How do you resolve that? In my mind, anyways, it seems like a contradiction, or at least lacks coherence. Thanks.
Thank you. I think overall pessimism is going to always win this kind of discussion. That we're not able to fully know as much as we wish we could be capable of knowing. You're right, creation in some ways goes against this idea of necessity. But this began when the first person built the first wheel. This will not end until everything that we turn is familiar to us. Everything we turn around to see will become familiar. And it is only the world that is familiar to us that we have any interest in. But the truth is, I'm a nihilist. I believe that all the values that we have are anthropomorphisms, and we require them in order to operate and function as functional human beings. The reason why I believe in necessities and not laws is this. Laws are descriptive. Necessities, we can't argue with that. How could one refute the necessity of a tone? How could one refute the necessity of a hammer swing? You can't.
One last question before we go to the next paragraph, next piece of your writing. Let's look at artists. Forget about mediocre artists. Look at only the great artist. Who are they? Who is a great artist, and what can they do that no one else can?
An artist can become a child to have new eyes. But in order to do that, they have to see beyond good and evil. I declared that whatever has been done out of love always occurs beyond good and evil. I think in this way that a child's love will always be far more than good and evil and beyond those things. But I think of a child not as a form of innocence, but in a form of openness, one who can create new eyes for themselves by giving up old perspectives.
Wonderful. We'll take one more question and then move on. Question from Phil.
Professor, we know that Bach was a very creative person. He was a superb artist. What do you think of his invention of temper intonation versus just intonation? Because he was creating a system that essentially froze the transformation of possibilities into a system that repeats itself. And since you are sort of against sustainability or the sustainer God, then how can you justify him freezing something into a mechanical system that on the one hand seems to open up the possibility of music, but in fact freezes it in a way that doesn't allow for other tonality to happen?
Well, let us take a moment to think about electronic musica, EDM. There's something very Dionysian about it, something very Apollonian about it. There's something orgiastic and something very rational. If it's able to appeal to both of our ears, an ear towards the strange and the ear towards the familiar, even if it were to repeat, it helps us feel a sense of rumination, a way of resetting ourselves. I think the Eternal Recurrence would be better approached if one spent some time ruminating over their patterns before they begin to look at how to change and challenge them. Bach's music represents this metaphysically. That's all I have to say about that, other than I enjoy playing Bach at brothels.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, this is what Nietzsche was known to do in his youth when he was in his college days.
Wonderful. All right, shall we move on to the next paragraph?
All right, let's go to, no, let's go back to the website. No, not that one. I had all this time to grab it, but let's see if it's this one. Share content. Website.
Take your time. You've been busy answering questions, you know.
Yes. All right. Now here we are. This one I think is a little bit. So let us read the passage that everybody has quoted and accused me of. By the way, I want to say that I myself never declared that God is dead. It was originally Martin Luther. So here we go. The madman. Have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran out to the marketplace, cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he gotten lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, immigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped in their midst and pierced them with his eyes and cried out, whither is God? I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? Who could we drink up? How could we drink up the entire sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe out the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continuously, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite horizon? Do we not feel the breath of empty air? Has it not become colder? Is not night continuously closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Don't we hear the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Then don't we smell the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we've killed him. It has been related further that in the same day that madman forced his way into several churches and there struck up his eternal resting place for God. Led out and called to account, he said always to have replied with nothing but the single answer. What, after all, are these churches now if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God? Mystical explanations. Mystical explanations are considered deep. The truth is, they're not even superficial.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Folks, questions? So let me start with the question that I had asked. What exactly is the Christian God?
The Judeo-Christian God is a God of transcendence. It is a Gnostic belief covered over by an ahistorical event of history, of monumental history. It is a metaphor that has been embellished and used over and over and over again to the point where it has been overused that it turned from coin originally to nothing more than scrap of metal. That is God.
Wow. Wow. So in most people's minds, it's mostly shadows.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Next up is L. L, go ahead. L, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Yes, this is excellent. I was just thinking that if man has killed God, I guess Christ also was considered to be killed by man, and that could be looked at. And I think the reference to Martin Luther was very good. So that's all really. So that could be seen also as, man killed God. And that could lead into Christ. That was my thought. Thank you.
Thanks. I've heard several stories around Martin Luther declaring that God is dead. One of them is a story that Martin Luther was at a very desperate point in his life where he was beginning to lose his faith. And his wife had come into the room and said, as a declaration, "Fine, God is dead, give it up." And Martin Luther stood up and said no, and went on and persevered because of this. Cynicism can lead us to some valuable insights. But I think cynicism, as I wanted to write it, was a way of birthing a religious leader. It was cynicism that advised Moses towards his Decalogue and his Exodus. It was cynicism that allowed Jesus to flip the money tables in Jerusalem. It was cynicism that inspired Martin Luther to nail the 95 Theses upon the wall at a church, at a Catholic church. It was cynicism that drove Dionysus to wanting to be sacrificed as a token to be turned into wine, because he was an undying God and he was able to be crucified as a symbol that brought fertility. I understand that the Roman punishment during the Punic Wars was to use this, because there were many people, many pretenders who tried to say they were divine. And that this was a way of putting that to the test. If you are truly divine, once we have killed you this way, you will resurrect like Dionysus and you will prove to us otherwise. Jesus was not stoned to death for committing a crime against his fellow Jews. He was crucified by the Romans. It's also good to point that from the Roman perspective, habeas corpus was an obsession of all legates, included Pontius Pilate. It would have been unheard of to allow the head of Jesus to find its way into the Roman Senate court, which would have led to Pontius Pilate being killed. Anybody who would have been crucified in those times would have been burnt afterward, preventing that, to prevent the habeas corpus. I thought about a great deal of these things before I wrote what I wrote about religion and about morality and about our society.
Thank you. Elle, you had a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. Yes, I was going to say that having read Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, he writes during a period when he could not speak openly because of the Roman Church being so critical of writings that would dissent from the government. And I think this is a good read as well. And I wonder what you thought of Thomas Hobbes, if you have an opinion, and thank you. Thanks.
Thomas Hobbes is my homeboy. I also think that it was also conveyed that Thomas Hobbes was an open, out and out atheist. And when he was challenged by a clergyman, he said that he was the friend of the king, and unless he could bring it up with the king and challenge him otherwise, there was no reason to pursue any kind of criticism towards Hobbes. And that's just an anecdotal story about Thomas Hobbes. He was once challenged on his atheism, and he said, you know, I'm the friend of the king. If you have a problem with me, take it up with him.
Thank you. Next questions are from Phil and Madeline. Phil, what's your question?
I wonder whether, Professor, I wonder whether the corruption and the abuse of the laws by the church creates such cynicism that people no longer believe in God died because of that? Or whether God died because of the mere exhaustion of living in the temple that eventually became a grave, that he died by pure exhaustion from the burden of living in the grave for such a long period. Could you say something about that?
What I want to do is I want to point out what the function the idea of God serves for the human subject. What function does it serve? Now, I've told you that the best definition is that God is some kind of rationalizing principle that gives the subject meaning. It's a proviso of meaning. Now, this is basic common sense. You can believe false things that can give you meaning just as much as you can believe true things. My issue with this was that the idea of God has now become a way of controlling people's behavior, and that it's producing a certain type of human that will be obedient through and through and easily commanded. I even claim that morality is the best system to guiding mankind by the nose. That's what morality is. It's a way of controlling it. Now, because we are in party company, I have to say something vulgar. I'm writing because I'm concerned about the sexual politics. Why, after all, would I say that truth is a woman who has reasons for concealing her reasons? Religion and morality is trying to control all of human behavior and really about what human behavior's real potential. It's holding that potential back because we are looking at the world through the lens of good and evil. So long as we're committed to that, and so long as we're unable to overcome that, we will live in that world.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline.
Yes, Herr Professor. We're here in this atemporal Zoom space created by Shrikant. I don't know how much of the era that the rest of us are living in you're able to see. But from my perspective, and I think that of many people, God has, and morality in some ways, have largely dissolved. And the rest of it has been balkanized into very rigid little fiefdoms of God beliefs, whether it's mechanistic physics or whether it's, an evangelical religion. But the rest of it has kind of dissolved. And so Phil's analogy of the Bach and his tempered scale was a good one, because it seems that the Prussian virtues that you were rebelling against were like Bach's tempered scale. But that tempered scale, yeah, it's something we use sometimes. We still appreciate it. But there are many other things available, and it's not just a polyphony, but a cacophony. So if you could see our era, can you comment on what you think of it?
What I think of it is that if you came to understand my 5 central ideas, I think you would have a complete understanding of what the problem is, but what the solution. The will to power is one of those things that I entertained in my youth and middle age and obsessed at throughout my life, but never got to a point of publishing. I feel that as an idea, it's been bastardized. It's been turned into metaphysics. And in some ways, that's okay, because it's about psychology. Human beings have always involved an extra dimension between the relationship between themselves and truth. And that extra dimension is power. that human beings want to be empowered by truth. They want to use truth as a system of power. Now, this can be used in grotesque ways, but it can also be used in beautiful ways. I would suggest that a lot of what I've said about the death of God is that it frees us up, but it takes away the veil that kept the world looking pretty. Now it looks ugly. Now the will to power is to present to us what we are really doing, what we are really using our values for, how we are really treating each other, and why do people obsess about power over knowledge and truth? What is that real relationship? Because it will tell us what the real value is.
Thank you. Next question is from Alvaro. Alvaro, go ahead.
Dr. Nietzsche, as a Stoic and as a Christian, something that I like about the philosophies and the beliefs that I embrace is that there are values that other people embraced and that I can now embrace. Your suggestion that we can come up with our own values basically telling me that I'm going to spend my whole life coming up with values. And I don't know if I'll be successful at the end, especially if I'm competing against other people who are coming up with their own values and I may be competing against. I want to ask you if, just as you're quoting Martin Luther and claiming that he's saying that God is dead, maybe he's also missing the fact that he was resurrected. So just as there is much speculation that in your last days of life, you became a madman, and then your philosophy has been resurrected, is there not more of a chance in Christianity or Stoicism, where there are values laid for us, that God can be resurrected than in your philosophy being resurrected?
I ontologically am committed to indeterminism. This is quintessential to my existential philosophy. It allows me to understand the viewpoint of not universalism, but perspectivism. I don't believe in truth with a capital T. I believe in truth with lower cases. I believe that there's a scientific truth. There's an experiential one. There is an aesthetic one. There is a psychological, social, historical one. These truths have a way of competing. Now, what I can say in this is we have to treat our values the same way that a trapper treats their prey. They set up a trap, a snare to catch a fish or a rabbit. Once the fish and rabbit has been caught, the snare, the trap, the net is tossed away because it has no use. That is, they've used it to get something else out of it. I think of the same thing for values, and they are values in the way that they offer us a perspective, and that's because they're functionally useful. That doesn't mean that we can't come to an agreement on values. It just means that our perspectivism can guide us to a mutuation.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Professor Nietzsche, how many more paragraphs do we have?
We just have, I think, let's see. Yeah, we only have two more passages. Well, three.
Okay, so let's go with the next paragraph, and we'll give Kate the chance to answer the question next. But go ahead. Let's go to the next paragraph.
Right. Gay science, subselection 130. A dangerous resolve. The Christian resolve to find the world ugly and bad has made the world ugly and bad. Subselection 343, the meaning of our cheerfulness, that the great recent event, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, has already begun to cast its first shadows over Europe. From Maxims and Errors, subselection 7, what is humanity? Just God's mistake, or God just the mistake of humanity?
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Kate. Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, have you ever considered that maybe creating your own values and creating a work of art out of your suffering is for Übermensch only, and that, you know, maybe most people are not really up to that and just want someone to tell them what their values should be. And even with the death of God, something else might take over, like politics or conspiracy theories or something like that.
Indeed. Well, what I thought about is that everybody is in their stage of life, and not everybody is at that state of the metamorphosis of being a child, of getting this. And for the most part, I think most people will not move from the metamorphosis of being spirit to camel. They won't move beyond that. They won't go out into the desert. They won't shake off all of the burden that they had taken on. They won't transform themselves into lions. And when they do, they still keep the burdens, and they tear up the burdens rather than find their dragon to overcome it. It's really basic common sense that a hammer can be used for an infinite series of activities. It's unfortunate some use that hammer to bash others in the head. It's even worse that most people thought that my philosophy motivated those type of murderers with a hammer. It's about values and about how we use it. We can use it constructively and we can use it destructively. But as I'm trying to advise you, that only as creators can you destroy. You have to have something else in its stead. If it falls down, there has to be something on top of it. Now I want to remind you of that movie, The Man of Steel, when Kal-El confronts General Zod, and Zod says, all of this is just going to be the foundation for Krypton, for new Krypton. It has to be based on something. We have to start over, we have to destroy it in order to build something great. Nietzsche, I think, is on the side of Kal-El, that says that no, you can take what's there and transform it into something positive and beautiful, something that is able to say yes to life and not no. General Zod is a person who's at the state of just taking his conventions and his advantages technologically to wipe out the human world, to supplant it with a new Krypton. I think that that's what I'm asking. I'm asking for us to think about being Kal-El and not General Zod.
Thank you. Next up is Dave, followed by Phil. Dave.
Yes, Professor. It seems to me that mankind is always advancing. We're always learning more. We're becoming better. We have more wealth. But it seems our eternal problem is that we always want more. We're always dissatisfied with what we have. Comment?
This is very true. I found this is very disgusting about the Europeans. They consumed everything. They burned everything up. I think in some sense, I feel a sense of sadness that I brought out the idea that Dionysus could offer us wisdom, because those who have accepted the Dionysian pill have become too destructive and too unreflective. I wrote the master-slave moral type thesis, not because I wanted you to think that I was on the side of masters. I want to tell you that I'm not on the side of the masters. I say that they are immoralists, they're not reflective, they have no conscience. What made human beings interesting was Judeo-Christianity, was the slave moral type, because it was imaginative. It wanted to play with values and thoughts. Unfortunately, they became canonized, and we weren't able to outgrow it. It got to the point where it became static, even though it evolved. This is very sad to me because the truth is, the master moral type is inside of all of our hearts. We are both master and slave moral types. Our slave moral type is when we try to present ourselves as good people, as decent people. Our master type is when we're angry with our spouse and our loved one and we take it out on them without any kind of restraint, any kind of conscience. I advised my reader to just trust all of whom the impulse was to punish, because this master moral type comes out and it is nasty and ugly. And it's more ugly now that it has been coupled and married to the slave moral type, because it doesn't have a conscience. And in between being told that you have a bad conscience and no conscience, how can you grow a real moral subject out of such unfertile fields called Christendom? I wrote a poem from the Dionysus diagrams where I said, the wasteland grows. Woe to thee who harbors wastelands within. The moralist is that wasteland. The moralist is the true nihilist, because they believe in afterworldly, otherworldly rewards for their behavior, not because they are convinced by an intellectual conscience as to what is right and wrong. They're convinced because of herd morality has told them an order of rank, that thou shalt not commit murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. I know it's a decalogue and I don't want to read them all out.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Phil, followed by Joe. Phil.
Yeah, I asked this earlier this morning to another meetup group, and since you're such a great artist and a great student of history as well, I thought I would ask you, after the Trojan War, when Odysseus was on his adventure, was he a person interested in wandering and adapting to the various environments and perspectives and circumstances as he wanted to invent new ways of dealing with the world that's strange? Or was he just simply trying to go home, to return home? Those seem to be polar opposites of tension that he had to live by. Could you say something about Odysseus trying to manage, on the one hand, being the ever wanderer that adapts a new situation, and the guy who actually just wanted to go back to Ithaca?
Ah, these Ithacans, they were the true atheists to the gods. This is why the gods reveled and rebelled against Odysseus and kept him from going home. This was a story about a fight between secularism, atheism, and theology, and this mythos. These gods were threatened. They feared that Odysseus would inspire atheism. This is why they stomped at him at every turn and tried to prevent him from making any headway. At the end of his journey, he says this wonderful thing: take heart. You have endured much. You can endure even more. This is Odysseus. For however clever Odysseus was in the Trojan War and in his Odyssey home, he had a heart that was unconquerable. Homo invictus hominem. That is the soul of Odysseus. Odysseus is the wonderful symbol of atheism because he used his mind to end that war. he used his mind to get himself home, in spite of all the things the gods put before him. I read Homer this way.
Wonderful, wonderful. And it looks like, Professor Nietzsche, you think that being like Odysseus all the time is being home. So the adventure and the center is the same for you, it appears. Next up is going to be Joe.
Hello, Professor Nietzsche. Again, thank you. So we're actually reading Dante's Inferno as part of one of our meetups. And you were saying that Christianity makes the world ugly and bad. But we're going through purgatory where there are things like wrath or pride, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, avarice. Are these things not ugly? So what is your opinion on that, in the sense that is this not something that makes the world worse?
I wrote in the beginning of the Gay Science about this issue. My issue is that evil men are rarely even evil. And even the furies of wrath and revenge, even though they can be visited upon an individual or several individuals, it is really no threat to humankind as a species. But when we think of these people, we cast them out as pariahs, as if they threaten the whole. And in some ways, this idea of evil is hyperbolic.
Thank you. Last question in this sequence is from Mike, and then we will go to the concluding paragraphs. We'll collect all the paragraphs, so there is time at the end for overall questions. Mike, go ahead.
You mentioned that Martin Luther was a major source of inspiration in many of your ideas. Martin Luther wrote in some detail how he did most of his writing and where he got most of his inspiration. Do you have can share some thoughts of what you thought of, what your process of writing and putting your thoughts together was all about?
I think I approached Martin Luther a little bit different than most people who read them. What I want to remind you, as Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, I was named after the Prussian king, Frederick Wilhelm II. My father was the pastor, the preacher for that kingdom. I was Polish nobility that was accepted in Prussia as Prussian nobility. When my father died and when democracy broke out, my aristocracy was run under. We were reduced to rabble. We were reduced by that democracy. And so the purpose that I was supposed to have, which would have been consular to the Kaiser, I was meant to be the source of religious wisdom. I no longer had a profession. I no longer had a purpose in this world. I went to try to find my purpose in the Franco-Prussian War. It broke me, it made me sick, and I spent the rest of my life in convalescence from this. I'm resentful of Germany. In fact, I rescinded my citizenship and declared that I was Swiss because of it. Those times affected me deeply. It also affected my idea of politics. I became very anti-democratic because I no longer had purpose in my world. This drove me to my own philosophy, thinking of how to live without a purpose. My purpose was taken from me when I was a child, and even before I was a young adult. I had no purpose other than to go and become a scholar. That became my own purpose. I failed in that, and I had to spend the rest of my life as a wanderer who wound up too sick, an invalid, and I lost control. I grabbed a horse I cried, I wept, and then I got sick and unwell and waited for my death.
Thank you. Last question from Linda, and then we will go to the concluding paragraphs, followed by the concluding Q&A. Linda.
Thank you for the opportunity. The professor, do you know that Christianity has built countless hospitals and schools around the world that greatly advance the quality of human life globally?
Indeed, I would agree with that. I would agree that religion is not only the great source of hope and of these positive things, but that isn't the end of the story. It's also the same source of despair. It is also the same source of evil, that it is inspired on both ends. My problem with that is that those who think from those spectrums can't think beyond them. They can't create new values because all they are doing is exercising their memory, not exercising their intellect. Those who exercise their intellect will always come up with better solutions because they're willing to play with it. They're willing to look at values the way an artist would look at his brush and his paint.
Wonderful. So Professor Nietzsche, shall we go to the concluding paragraphs?
Yes. So let's start over with what I had begun. Only as creators, we can only destroy as creators. But let us not forget this either. There it is. Now I can see, sorry. But let us not forget this either. It is not enough to create new names and new estimations and probabilities in order in the long run to create new things. New struggles. After Buddha died, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will still be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. This one might be a little bit long. This one we might want to digest on a bit more. This passage is the actual passage of the death of God. Passage 108 is a prologue account of this, and passage 125 is three different voices. The voice and cynic of Diogenes at the beginning, the voice of Nietzsche all the way down to this point, and then at some, and don't you hear the noise of the grave diggers? This is the beginning of Martin Luther, from the transition from Nietzsche to Martin Luther, where Martin Luther says, God is dead, God remains dead, and we've killed him. The rest of this is Nietzsche's own reaction to that. Now, I've added these other ones to show to you what Nietzsche's own opinion about religion and mysticism, what his opinion really is explicitly, so that you can read this. His view is that the Christian resolve to find the world ugly and bad has made the world ugly and bad. That is, as Nietzsche saw it, they have anthropomorphized and added that aesthetic to the world, as Nietzsche says up here. The total character of the world, however, is an all eternity chaos, not in a sense, not of a lack of necessity, but a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom, or whatever other names there are for our aesthetic anthropomorphisms. This allows us to understand that Nietzsche's own viewpoint that we have imposed values upon the world and upon one another in ways that have crippled us, not enabled us, or let's say encouraged us to strike out in the beyond. My own view is that God is a mistake of man? What, is humanity just God's mistake, or God just the mistake of humanity? My view is that God is our mistake. The reason why I have this view is that I agree with Kant. Out of this crooked timber called humanity, nothing straight can be fashioned. His view is that, in contrast to Aristotle or Plato, that man is the rational among the animal. Kant's view is that man is the animal among the rational. My view is that this is sick, this is twisted, this changes the confidence of the human subject and their ability to discern truth from falsity. So now I'm going to come back. Hi, everybody.
All right, wonderful, wonderful. So, Mr. Nietzsche, this has been amazing. Now, final round of questions. Now, you don't, folks, at this point, you don't need to confine yourself to any particular topic. You can talk about anything on Nietzsche, but only about Nietzsche, okay? Only about Nietzsche, and focus on questions, okay? Only questions. We don't have much time. I want to give chance to as many people to ask questions as possible. So let's start with Dave, followed by Phil. Dave.
Professor, I understand that you've been in poor health your whole life. Constant headaches, problems with your body, really suffering, but it seems you've been driven to write a lot of books. And do you want to comment about how your personal suffering may have affected your motivation to write and also your viewpoints?
My father and my uncle, my great uncle, my grandfather, my great uncle, all were diagnosed at their deaths as the cause for their deaths as brain softening. I believe this is code now for brain cancer. I more likely died of brain cancer, but I contracted dysentery in the Franco-Prussian War because I was an orderly and medic at the front, and I dealt with a lot of the dying and dead and the sick and the wounded. And I myself contracted dysentery that made my life unbearable. I wrote because it was the only sanctuary I had in my own lonely life. I tried to marry Lou Salome. She turned me down. I tried to marry several other women I requested, and I was turned down further. My life has been a solitary life because of the times that I lived in. And of course, because the Germany that I grew up with as a child was not the Germany that I had as an adult, that I stayed away from my own home. The only thing I can tell you philosophically is that perhaps I should read it. Let's go to it and read my favorite selection. All right, from the Gay Science, subselection 106, 1882. Music as one's advocate. I'm thirsting for a composer, said the innovator to this disciple, who will learn my ideas from me and transpose them into his own language. That way I should reach everyone's ears and hearts far better. With music, one can seduce everyone to every error and every truth. Who could refute a tone? Then would you like to be considered irrefutable, said the disciple. The innovator replied, I wish the seedling to become a tree. But for a doctrine to become a tree, it has to be believed for a good while. For it has to be believed, it also is considered irrefutable. But the tree needs storms, it needs doubts, worms, nastiness to reveal the nature and strength of the seedling. Let it break if it's not strong enough. A seedling can only be destroyed, but can never be refuted. When he had said that, the disciple cried out impetuously, I believe in your cause, and I consider it so strong that I shall say everything that I still have in mind against it. The innovator laughed, wagged his finger at him, and said, this kind of discipleship is the best, but it's also the most dangerous, and not every kind of doctrine can endure it. This is what I learned from my own life. This is what I learned from my own masters, to take from their wisdom and to create a kind of prologue methodology to present philosophy. And what do I mean by that? Everybody has heard of the story of Midas. I told it far more different. My story went something like this. Midas, he was challenged at his own court. He's an old man. He's been told by his son and those who in his prince's court that they're going to murder me. I'm going to be usurped and my son is going to take the throne. And out of angst, I don't know what to do because this is meant to happen, but I don't want it to happen. So I need to seek good counsel. I have recently heard that the satyr Silenus has been found in a nearby forest in my kingdom. So I hunt Silenus down and I trap him. And I approach him and I ask him a very single, serious, sober question. What is the best thing for mankind? Silenus doesn't want to answer. He begins to laugh at him. Midas pokes him. Tell me, you little shit. Silenus smiles and said, the second best thing is to die soon. The first best is to have never been born at all. Midas, struck by this, he wavers. He grabs a wineskin at the side of Silenus and pours it into his mouth, and then takes on the power of transmutation, for which everything he touches turns to gold. I take stories and I use them and I embellish them with this kind of alternative account so that I can show the wisdom of it. This is my philosophy. I didn't expect the people who read me to pick this up. But now that I'm talking tonight and I'm reincarnated, perhaps you'll read me again with new eyes and new heart.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Phil, followed by Brian. Phil, what's your question?
Yeah, my question is, obviously you're praising the virtues of the iconoclast. You are very interesting in that regard. I wonder what you think of this poem that I wrote. I'm not going to recite it. I'm just going to say the essence of it. It's called Ode to the Heretics. It's about the Buddha of Bamiyan. And I said that in the poem, it says, Buddha told his disciples, if you should run into me in the road, you need to kill me. And then the other one is, please don't turn me into a god. His disciples disobeyed him, but it was the heretics who blew him up and let him go to nirvana. And at the end, I said, the two lines were, and now he just a pile of rubble, but in the pile was the silent smile of Buddha. What do you think of that poem?
I loved Buddha. I became obsessed with Buddha because I was obsessed with Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer was obsessed with the Vedas and Bhagavad Gita and Hinduism in general, and Buddhism as its contrast. I wrote the Gay Science Subselection 108 the way I did because I was told the story about the end of Buddha's life. I want to tell you that there's a parallel between Buddha and Socrates. In that they held their own private conviction of what they thought about life, that they might have presented an idealized form of what life should represent. After all, Socrates was known as an eternal optimist in his dialogues, no matter how ironic he was in his questioning and full of doubt. Buddha, in some ways, was different. Not that his doubt led him to further doubt. His doubt led him to wisdom. And I think in some ways, the ism part of Buddha is where my problem is. It's what they did with these ideas that transformed it. Most of the ideas that came out of the formalization of, let's say, Zen Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, these are very beautiful. Mahayana Buddhism, these schools, I'm not arguing against. What I'm arguing against is what the common people use in this. It's a form of ancestral worship. It's a form of thinking that the antiquarian and the monumental aspects of history should bury the present, the now. In my work on the use and abuse of history of life, my view was that most people don't use the critical sense of history. They have an antiquarian sense of history. They have a monumental sense of history, but they don't possess the critical sense of history. And even worse, there are people who have ahistorical values, super historical values, and historical values. And in some ways, they're a collage. They've been put into a chili pot and forced to get on. Not all of them are supposed to be together. It's too cheesy, full of beans and rice. It's too much ingredients for one pot. The reason why I wrote that passage 108 was that I saw that Socrates, at his end of his life, he regretted everything about himself. His last words to Crito was, "O Crito, sacrifice a rooster to a Scepulus, for now I am cured of life." Socrates at bottom was a pessimist. Wasn't Buddha? He had lived with this idea that one could transcend one's suffering until he was met with old age and real, undeniable, irreversible suffering. He wanted an escape. He wanted that assassin to give him the tainted pork. He begged his followers to allow that assassin to give him that food. He had been laying on his side and he had been in such torment of pain in his old age that he just wanted it to end. Was not Buddha a pessimist too? Because that affected his followers. They constructed a shadow of him and tried to make him immemorial in the same way that Christians try to take the suffering of Christ and make that immemorial. They're worshiping shadows. They're not worshiping the light. They're worshiping the shadows. This is the ugliness of mankind. This is what makes mankind ugly.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask one question and then we'll go to Brian's question. You spoke of the Bhagavad Gita and Veda. The core principle of Indian philosophy is Tattvamasi. So that means that the God is within you. And most of us forget that with this Maya, which is all kinds of shadows. And you mistake the shadow for yourself or for God or whatever it is. But what you're really focused on are shadows, which actually mean nothing. So the principle that this is within each person is very different from the principle that only few people have it. So do you think it is that that everybody can become a Ubermensch, or is that reserved only for few? And is it something about what they do, what they choose, that makes it so, or is it in their own nature? Are most human beings limited in their being, or they are limited only by their choices?
Oh my God, this is such a hard question to answer because there's nothing nice about the answer. I wrote two different versions of the eternal recurrence of the same. One you'll find in the Gay Science, selection 341. Another you will find in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra encounters a dwarf, and the dwarf and him have an exchange. And what Zarathustra tells the dwarf is that most people that you'll meet, they will be over ears, over nose, over eyes, over mouth, over head, over arms, over feet, over heart, over bum. They will be cripples in a different way than you. His view was that not everybody should be the Ubermensch. This isn't something for the select aristocracies. This is something painful. I'm telling you that to become the Ubermensch will be very, very dangerously painful. You will have to take your pain and transform it into art. And you will have to fail at that over and over and over again until you get good and master that activity. It is only after learning how to master it that you can transcend that mastery and be a real master with childlike eyes. But in truth, nobody, as I said, a book for none and all in Zarathustra, nobody can really become this. This is something that is hard and difficult. Most of us will try it in the same way that Zarathustra was met with a tightrope walker who tried it themselves. And what happened? They stepped onto the wire, the devil jumped over them, they came falling down head first, they crashed upon the ground, and then, unfortunately, they begged Zarathustra to bring them to heaven. Zarathustra said, your soul has died well before your body. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no God, no devil. He says, well, if I die, then I die for nothing. His response is no. You died living on the edge. You died by trying to overcome your limits. This is beautiful. That is meaningful. It isn't the fact that you're supposed to achieve anything with this. It's the fact that you try at it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Brian.
Yes, first of all, Professor, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. You have been a fascination and an enigma for me since high school. And I really have never recovered or understood you. So I appreciate so much your giving, so much of what you've given this evening. The one thing I do remember in all my readings on Nietzsche is the greatest human characteristic is the gift or the urge for giving. And I felt that you've exemplified that so much this evening. I look forward to more if you're willing to do so. I do have a question. What led to your breakup with Richard Wagner?
Christianity and anti-Semitism. Well, no, anti-Semitism motivated by Christianity.
Wonderful. All right. So Professor Nietzsche, this was amazing. And Professor Nietzsche will be back. There will be an eternal recurrence of this meetup every week on Monday. And next time, would you like to be talking about Übermensch, or would you like to talk about will to power?
Let's do the will to power as the form of existentialism.
Okay.
Right. The perspectivism, will to power, and existentialism, because if I talk about that, it will complement not only what we talked about with the death of God, but it will link us to the eternal recurrence, to the Übermensch, and then to my critique of morality.
Wonderful. So could you let me know what sections within the post people should read so people can come prepared to listen to you?
I have it prepared today. So
okay.
I will have that to you tonight.
Wonderful. All right, folks, thank you very much. This was just amazing, amazing experience. And we will, Phil, you had a quick question? Logistical question?
Just a quick response. Since it's going to be a week, there will be a punctuated period before the cycle happens again, right?
Yes.
But that is only for other people. Mr. Nietzsche will be going at it without any punctuation, I assure you. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. And Dan, just tremendously delightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
very much. That was awesome.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.